What if I told you there was once a king so physically deformed that his own people believed he was cursed by the devil himself? Meet Charles II of Spain, a monarch whose appearance was so shocking that even his royal court whispered he must be bewitched. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched one. But here's the thing. Charles wasn't cursed by supernatural forces. He was cursed by something far more sinister, his own royal bloodline. This is the story of how the most powerful dynasty in Europe destroyed itself from within, creating a king so deformed that when he finally died, his autopsy revealed horrors that seemed to confirm every supernatural fear his subjects had whispered about for decades. And if you're ready to dive into more shocking historical secrets that textbooks won't tell you, hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started with the disturbing truth behind royal power. 1. The jaw that couldn't close. When foreign ambassadors first met Charles II, many couldn't hide their shock. Here was the king of the most powerful empire on earth, and he couldn't even close his mouth. His jaw protruded so far forward that his lips couldn't meet, leaving his mouth hanging open like a broken door. This wasn't some accident of birth, but the inevitable result of 2 centuries of the Habsburg family's darkest obsession. They called it keeping the bloodline pure. But what they were really doing was playing genetic Russian roulette with their own descendants. The Habsburgs had a simple rule. Marry family, keep power concentrated. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and sometimes the family connections got so twisted that a single person could be their own cousin multiple times over. His parents, they were uncle and niece. His grandparents on both sides, also uncle and niece. Go back far enough and you'll find that Charles had the genetic diversity of someone whose family had been isolated on a desert island for generations. The result was what doctors call mandibular prognathism, but everyone else called the Habsburg jaw. Charles's lower jaw stuck out so dramatically that when he closed his mouth, there was still a gap you could slide a coin through. His teeth didn't line up at all. The top row sat completely behind the bottom row, making chewing impossible. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Every meal became a humiliating ordeal. Palace kitchens had to prepare his food like baby mush. Everything pureed, mashed, or liquid. Even then, eating was a messy, laborious process. Soup would leak from the corners of his mouth. Solid food would just fall out. Royal dinners, which should have been displays of majesty and power, became grotesque spectacles where servants constantly dabbed saliva from their king's chin. The worst part, his speech was almost unintelligible. The same jaw deformity that made eating impossible turned every royal proclamation into a struggle. Foreign diplomats needed interpreters, not because of language barriers, but because they literally couldn't understand what the Spanish king was trying to say. His words came out as wet, slurred mumbles that even his own courtiers had trouble deciphering. Palace records show that Charles's own mother, Queen Mariana, wrote letters describing her terror that her son might choke to death on his own tongue during sleep. The most powerful ruler in Europe was considered a choking hazard. And the truly horrific part, the Habsburgs knew their marriages were producing increasingly deformed children, but they kept going anyway. Power was more important than the physical agony of their offspring. By the time Charles was born, he was essentially a living experiment in what happens when human genetics go catastrophically wrong. 2. A body that defied nature. The Habsburg jaw was just the tip of the iceberg. Charles II's entire body was a mess, and the full extent of his deformities would have made medieval villagers cross themselves in terror. At 35 years old, Charles looked like a sick child who had been stretched and twisted by some cruel force. He barely reached 5 feet tall, but it wasn't just his height that was wrong. His proportions were completely off. His head was massively oversized compared to his frail body, bobbing around on a neck so weak it could barely support the weight. His limbs were stick-thin and appeared almost skeletal, while his torso was oddly compressed and hunched. Charles couldn't even walk until he was 8 years old. Think about that for a moment. Most children take their first steps around their first birthday. Charles spent nearly a decade unable to support his own body weight. Even when he finally managed to walk, it was more of a stumbling shuffle. Palace records described him lurching from wall to wall using furniture for support like an elderly man. Despite being in his supposed prime, his spine was so severely curved that he appeared permanently hunched over, giving him the silhouette of someone carrying an invisible burden. And in a way, he was the burden of generations of genetic damage concentrated into one catastrophically unlucky individual. The mental effects were equally devastating. Charles had the intellectual capacity of a child well into his adult years. He couldn't read until he was 10 years old, and even then, he struggled with basic comprehension. Court tutors described trying to teach him as attempting to fill a broken vessel. Information would go in, but nothing seemed to stick. His emotional regulation was that of a toddler trapped in an adult's body. Palace servants reported that Charles would throw violent tantrums over minor inconveniences, screaming and thrashing like a child denied a toy. These would be followed by periods of complete withdrawal, where he would sit motionless for hours staring at nothing, completely unresponsive to the world around him. Even his hair betrayed his genetic damage. It grew in thin, patchy clumps that fell out regularly, leaving him with a scalp that looked more like a diseased animal's hide than a royal crown. Court painters were forced to use creative liberties in his official portraits, but even their most flattering attempts couldn't completely hide the reality of what Charles had become. The most disturbing part, Charles's condition was getting worse as he aged. While most people reach physical maturity and stabilized, Charles was actively deteriorating. His already weak body was failing faster than normal aging could account for. Doctors of the era had no explanation for what they were witnessing. A living human whose genetics had failed so completely that his body seemed to be actively trying to shut down. 3. The king who couldn't make heirs. Here's where Charles II's tragic story becomes a continental disaster. The most powerful throne in Europe belonged to a man who couldn't produce a single heir. Charles married twice, desperately trying to fulfill the most basic requirement of kingship, continuing the dynasty. His first wife was Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess who arrived in Spain expecting to marry a king and instead found herself bound to what courtiers whispered was barely a man. The wedding night was reportedly a disaster. Palace servants later testified that Marie-Louise emerged from the royal bedchamber in tears, and Charles appeared confused and distressed. The same genetic mutations that had twisted his body had also left him functionally impotent. His reproductive organs were so underdeveloped that doctors of the era described them as infantile. Essentially, Charles had the sexual maturity of a prepubescent boy trapped in an adult's failing body, but the Spanish court couldn't admit this publicly. Instead, they blamed Marie-Louise for being barren, subjecting her to humiliating medical examinations and treatments. She was forced to drink disgusting herbal concoctions, undergo painful procedures, and endure the constant scrutiny of a court that desperately needed her to produce an heir that her husband was biologically incapable of providing. The psychological toll was devastating. Marie-Louise, once described as vivacious and intelligent, became withdrawn and depressed. She spent her days in prayer begging God for a miracle that would never come. Some historians suggest she may have been slowly poisoned by the stress treatments and fertility medicines forced upon her. When Marie-Louise died mysteriously at age 26, Charles was quickly remarried to Maria Anna of Neuburg. The second wedding was an even more desperate affair. By this point, Charles was in his 30s and his physical condition had deteriorated further. Maria Anna later wrote private letters describing her horror at her husband's appearance and her growing realization that producing an heir was impossible. The court tried everything. They brought in the best doctors from across Europe, consulted ancient fertility texts, and even attempted magical remedies. Charles was subjected to humiliating examinations where physicians prodded and measured his genitals, trying to find some way to make them functional. Nothing worked because the problem wasn't medical. Meanwhile, the rest of Europe was watching and waiting. Everyone knew that when Charles died without an heir, the Spanish throne would be up for grabs, and every major power had claims they were prepared to enforce with armies. The War of Spanish Succession was already brewing in diplomatic circles, just waiting for Charles's inevitable death. The irony is staggering. The Habsburgs had spent centuries obsessively controlling marriages to concentrate power, and their final king couldn't even consummate a marriage. Their genetic purity had created a man so damaged that he couldn't perform the most basic biological function required of a monarch. 4 exorcisms in the royal palace. When medical science failed to explain or cure Charles II, the Spanish court turned to the supernatural. What followed were some of the most bizarre and disturbing religious ceremonies ever performed on a living monarch. Public exorcisms conducted in the royal palace itself. The church had a simple explanation for Charles's condition. He was possessed by demons. Father Frel Landaz, the court's chief exorcist, declared that Charles was inhabited by multiple evil spirits that had been placed there through witchcraft. But here's where it gets truly wild. The exorcisms weren't conducted in some hidden chapel. These were full-scale theatrical productions held in the throne room, with nobles and foreign dignitaries forced to watch their king writhing on the floor while priests screamed Latin incantations over his convulsing body. Father Diaz would begin by forcing Charles to drink holy water mixed with ground-up religious relics. The king would immediately become violently ill, probably from drinking what was essentially dirty water filled with bone fragments, which the priests interpreted as demons fighting the holy substances. Charles would vomit, shake uncontrollably, and sometimes lose consciousness. While Father Diaz shouted that he could see the devils leaving the king's body, the ceremonies could last for hours. Charles, already weak and confused, would be subjected to aggressive physical manipulations as priests attempted to literally wrestle demons from his flesh. They would press crucifixes against his skin until he screamed, splash him with holy water, and force him to recite prayers in Latin, a language he could barely comprehend given his intellectual limitations. But the exorcists didn't stop with Charles himself. They became convinced that the entire royal palace was cursed, leading to one of the most bizarre episodes in royal history. In 1698, Father Diaz ordered a systematic purification of the palace that resembled something between spring cleaning and supernatural warfare. Servants were ordered to collect every item that might be contaminated by witchcraft. This included personal belongings of previous queens, gifts from foreign courts, and even pieces of furniture. These objects were carried to the palace courtyard and burned in massive bonfires, while priests chanted exorcism prayers. The most disturbing part was that Charles seemed to believe it was working. His limited mental capacity made him susceptible to suggestion, and when priests told him that demons were being expelled, he would experience temporary relief from his constant physical pain. This created a horrific cycle where Charles would beg for more exorcisms whenever his symptoms worsened. The exorcisms reached their peak in 1699, when Father Diaz claimed he had successfully identified and expelled 47 different demons from Charles's body. Each demon supposedly had a specific name and had been responsible for different aspects of Charles's condition. The king was so exhausted by this marathon spiritual assault that he collapsed and didn't speak for 3 days. The tragic reality was that while Charles was being subjected to medieval torture disguised as spiritual healing, he was also deteriorating rapidly from actual medical conditions that 17th century science couldn't understand. 5. The autopsy that shocked Europe. When Charles II finally died in 1700 at age 38, the Spanish court faced a moment of terrible truth. They had spent decades claiming their king was cursed by supernatural forces, but now they needed to know what had actually been inside the body of the man they called El Hichi. What the royal physicians discovered during Charles's autopsy was so shocking that the official report was initially suppressed, deemed too disturbing for public consumption. But the details eventually leaked out, and they painted a picture of internal horror that seemed to confirm every supernatural fear his subjects had whispered about for decades. Dr. Geronimo de la Fuente Pierola, the royal physician who conducted the examination, wrote what became one of the most horrifying medical documents in European history. According to his report, Charles's body was more like that of a monster than a man, containing organs so malformed and diseased that it seemed impossible he had lived as long as he did. Let's start with his heart. Dr. Pola described it as no larger than a walnut, shriveled and blackened like a piece of burned meat. A normal adult heart weighs about 300 g. Charles's heart appeared to weigh less than 50. It was so small and damaged that physicians marveled he had been able to circulate blood at all. His lungs were described as corroded and gangrenous, filled with fluid and what appeared to be rotting tissue. The smell emanating from his chest cavity was reportedly so foul that several assistants fled the room. But the most disturbing discoveries were in his abdomen. Charles' intestines were described as putrefied and gangrenous, essentially rotting inside his body. The reproductive organs that had caused so much political turmoil were revealed to be catastrophically underdeveloped. Perhaps most shocking of all was what they found in his skull. When physicians opened Charles's head, they discovered that his brain was surrounded by an abnormal amount of fluid, what we now know as hydrophilus. His brain tissue itself appeared damaged and discolored, which explained his intellectual disabilities and erratic behavior. Dr. Polda concluded his report with a statement that sent shockwaves through European courts. "It is a miracle this body sustained life for so long, as it contained not a single healthy organ." The autopsy findings were so extreme that they actually reinforced supernatural beliefs rather than dispelling them. How could someone survive with organs this damaged? Unless dark forces were involved. The medical evidence seemed to prove that Charles truly had been cursed, just not in the way anyone expected. What makes this even